Died too.
Is
okay.
it?
We're live now. Okay. Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz. We're here with you live this evening here on YouTube, talking about all sorts of things. Going to be taking your questions as well. Apologies on the delay. We're having a bit of issues here on the end of the streaming software, so I apologize to everybody about that. But we're just reading the chat live here. We've got everything going. We're going to be talking, for the first 30, 40 minutes about everything going on. Dimitri, how are you doing?
Doing good, Conrad. It's awesome to be here, and it's like that joke when when you're just trying to set up the stream and the Rothschilds just throw a wrench in your way. You just have to deal with it. But we're here now, and so bringing it to you, episode 40, and it's exciting. It's a big episode, almost 1 year of news, 1 year of epic, unique content, and again, we're just glad to be here. And it's our second live stream, at least since the Prigozhin coup, you can say, because that first live stream did occur in the Prigozhin coup weekend, and we kind of gave it a preliminary analysis, and things really didn't turn out as we expected. I don't think anybody expected the news to kind of turn the way it did. And well, today is a bit more calm because obviously nobody is driving any tanks or columns of Wagner troops at Moscow, and we're not really awaiting any presidential speeches at the moment, but there's still definitely a lot going on in the world.
Yeah, totally. And be sure to share the stream link if you can. Send it around. Get as many people in here as possible. We appreciate it. We're taking questions, so send in any super chats. We finally have those up. I know we didn't have those up last stream, so if you want to ask any questions, be sure to send those in. We'll ask if there's any of those. We'll ask those at the end. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. And I kind of want to just dive right into, while there wasn't as much news specifically this week, I was saying right before I was planning for this stream that, as usual, Lukashenko, he's going to come out with something before we record, and he totally did. I mean, we saw his latest interview with that Ukrainian journalist, who apparently the Ukrainian journalist is now, being threatened with, sanction and censorship because of this interview with Lukashenko. It was, pretty brutal, I guess, towards the Ukrainian side. But this is the kind of thing that, like, I think Lukashenko should be doing these every week. I don't know if you agree, Dimitri, but he had the map out. He had his pointer. It looked something like a wand from Harry Potter that he was just using to assess the situation on the map. And he made it very clear, that I don't know, it seems that he was being kind of an independent operator. I mean, he made it very clear that Vladimir Putin had, made it clear to him that he needs him to have his back, that he was afraid of a betrayal in Belarus from the West, and, of Belarus, shifting towards the West. And of course, we know that did not happen. And, Lukashenko speaking very openly about, if Ukraine doesn't play its cards right, it could easily lose all of its territory. So he's very much acting as this sort of spearhead into the diplomatic conversation, I guess, about the rhetoric surrounding, everything that's going on with the current status of negotiations, because we know that the Ukrainians are still talking about Crimea, but now we even have Western war hawks talking about how they're going to need to start ceding territory, or they're just going to get completely wiped out.
Yeah, I mean, Lukashenko with that little stick, essentially like a Russian Soviet high school teacher, it's almost as if the kid's misbehaving, he's going to get a smack on the hand as well. So he's kind of like educating people. The POV of Lukashenko, of the SMO, he's showing people, well, I've been watching for 1.5 years, and I know exactly how things should go, or, would go, at least diplomatically. But what's interesting is that just the Ukrainian journalist being threatened by her own people, by all these neo-Nazi Telegram channels, and they're being basically claiming you let Lukashenko speak too freely. You didn't, say, criticize him openly. Similar to, I mean, it's not exactly an analogous comparison, but if you think about just purely things, remember his famous interview with Nick Fuentes, which kind of brought Nick Fuentes back to YouTube, and everybody criticized her. Wow, you let Fuentes speak too openly and clearly, right, about all these right-wing subjects. You didn't confront him. And similar to this Ukrainian journalist, she allowed Lukashenko to basically spill his version of events, which, mind you, was very PG, and everything Lukashenko said, we kind of, I mean, not just me and you, but the audience itself was very aware of, if you guys followed the news for the last, I don't know, year and a half. So Lukashenko's version of the SMO is very much grounded in reality. Even the numbers of troops, which he mentioned, wasn't outrageous. He didn't mention like 6 figures or hundreds and thousands of dead Ukrainians. It was very obvious as to how many people fell during this failed counteroffensive, and Lukashenko made it clear that, look, and again, this is, I think people should pay attention. Lukashenko, notice he is coming out as this almost neutral diplomatic figure, similar to what he came out as during the Wagner coup situation. So it's almost as if he's positioning himself to, if Russia ever does face a peace treaty with Ukraine, Lukashenko wants to be the guy that benefits. He's in the middle. He's the peacemaker. He's like this, the king of diplomacy in Eastern Europe. He doesn't want some Xi Jinping coming in, or even, God forbid, Erdogan because Erdogan used to play this neutral role amidst the conflict, especially prior to his re-election. So I think it is a very interesting perspective from him, and obviously there is personal gain for him on a personal individual level. So. And he doesn't really want to still be subordinate to Putin. He wants to remain kind of in an equal partnership, despite the fact that Belarus essentially is a vassal state of the Russian Federation and has been for a long time, even economically speaking.
Well, look, I'm a Belarusian nationalist. I support the growing ties between Belarus and the American nationalist state. But I think you're right as well, and I think Putin actually has a lot to benefit from having Lukashenko be like, if Lukashenko is like the middleman, that's basically negotiating on his terms, right? Because if Lukashenko is viewed as kind of the middle ground between the West and Russia, that's very much much more of a pro-Russian kind of perspective that's coming to the table. Of course, the Americans would rather have, I don't know, the Poles, I guess, help negotiate. I mean, maybe not. They're probably afraid that the Poles would get too crazy and drag us all, into actual World War III, which is what they seem to want us to do. But it's a good thing you mentioned Erdogan, because he at the beginning, there was some of the most, in the more recent revelations that Putin said that what he might have done at some of those summits with Turkey and everything, that would have been terrible, frankly. Like, if some of that had come to fruition, these were terrible deals. This was like Minsk III level stuff that would have just led to a much greater conflict later on. But yeah, Erdogan, of course, was, for most of the SMO, was playing, especially before his election, was playing both sides, really trying, if anything, coming off slightly more on Putin's side compared to the rest of the international community. But now, not only did he do the whole Vilnius nonsense with Ukraine and NATO, and be who knows if Putin's even going to be able to go to Ankara anytime soon, despite the previously scheduled visits. But now they're also having a whole bunch of standoffs in the Black Sea. Apparently Russia's firing on Turkish ships in the Black Sea. Some of these are even farther south, and even I saw a video. It was a ship, I believe, that was flagged under Palau, but it was I can't remember. I think it might have been a Ukrainian or Turkish ship, but its flag was Palau, a tiny irrelevant island nation in the South Pacific. But Russian forces stormed the ship. You had them jump on, guns pointed at the crew. They were very polite, talked to the captain, but it was, full on, we're in a full on kind of blockade war in the Black Sea, where no one's insuring anybody, and those ships that are still out to sea are getting caught up in this full-on military conflict. And I don't think, for anyone just tuning in that isn't already an audience member, I don't think you need us to tell you that we already have a path kind of mapped out about where the potential conflicts on the Black Sea between Russia and Turkey could go. And as Lukashenko talked about the possibility of, a pincer maneuver coming in from Transnistria, taking all of Odessa and everything. So all of this is on the table for a total Russian Black Sea and the dominion of the whole northern coast. And that will inevitably kind of diminish Turkey's neutral status and accelerate them as a direct enemy of Russia. And I think we're already seeing that happen with these boats. And the next step, of course, is, Turkey facing both pressure from the West and maybe even wanting to flex its own muscles in the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, which, as you can see, we are, that's where we are tonight. If you see our, the view from my window, which this is clearly on the screen.
It's gorgeous, really. The sort of, the land of perspective, the land of the future, and the return to the second Rome, essentially what the Russian Orthodox people were planning to do for hundreds and hundreds of years. It still hasn't come to fruition, but here we are talking about geopolitics. But it's interesting because the Turkish ship, or allegedly was mostly Turkish, but even flying under this bizarre flag. So the Russians, of course, saw this inconsistency and wanted to check it out. Perhaps it was Ukrainian. They just wanted to see what was happening. And the captain actually didn't respond to Russian calls in English or Russian over the radio. So essentially, that's why they actually went on board and did a full-on scan exactly what's happening. And of course, it looks really rude from Russian perspective, checking out a mostly Turkish ship. So it is a punch in the gut for Erdogan, but definitely not as hard as Erdogan releasing the Azov battalion troops, which occurred, about a month ago now. But the Azov troops have reportedly already appeared on the Bakhmut and Zaporozhye front. People who, essentially Azov fighters, some of the formal ones, as well as, I guess, new recruits into the Azov battalion appearing with, Black Sun symbols and other symbols, throwing back to World War II days, and appearing essentially on the front lines again, bolstering the Ukrainian forces. And again, it's almost like Erdogan is now directly tied to the Azov battalion simply because he released all of their leaders and all of their most popular spokespersons. And of course, it's not just Erdogan's fault or anything of that nature. It also has direct ties to Israel, and just that Hava Nagila video we saw earlier with the Azov fighters dancing in a circle. It ties to that. It ties to Abramovich, of course, feeding them tiramisu on his yacht, and of course, in an unsanctioned fashion, traveling between Israel and Moscow continuously. So it's just this bizarre coalition there of everybody helping Azov, but nobody really assisting Russia. So Russia has to take matters into its own hands and fight back, win back its own reputation for actually being a regional power, which actually checks these random ships flying under like these small sovereign countries' flags, essentially. Just traveling amidst a really hot war, especially amongst the ports of Odessa and even the ports of Nikolaev not really being safe. So it's I think it's completely fine that Russia did this, and in fact, yes, as you said, it was completely very polite. Most of what Russia does is actually incredibly polite. Even say the way it treats its refugees, all of the footage is incredibly polite. The POW footage, the footage of all these inspections, it's like almost like the Russians still have this gentlemanly feel about them. There almost is little to no abuse that's actually caught on camera, which is impressive, and maybe speaks to the fact that many of the Russian soldiers still have that Christian cultural heritage, which we speak about very often. And yes, Erdogan again, his comments regarding that, I don't think they were caught. They were kind of unofficially published, the fact that he's just not happy with how Russia's conducting itself in the Black Sea and how he's speaking about international waters needing to remain neutral. I think it's there's a lot that needs to happen in Russian-Turkish relations for it to be normalized or brought back to an end of 2022 level, I think, because so much has changed. Finland and Sweden are now in NATO, which was unprecedented. We haven't had this since even the Soviet times. It was unimaginable for Sweden and Finland both at the same time. Imagine in the span of a few months joining NATO. Putin, of course, it's not like it was Putin's fault that he somehow angered Erdogan. Putin has made so many concessions towards the Sunni Muslims. You remember he put on a show in Dagestan earlier this year, where he held up the Quran, said this is a blessed book for all religions, a sacrilegious statement. Dagestan was hit by an earthquake a few days later. These big events occur, and of course Putin, put away the Nikita Zhuravlyov. The prosecution managed to put away that young bloke from, I think it was the 22nd of May this year. He burnt the Quran publicly in Moscow and, of course, filmed it all and posted it on TikTok. Now Nikita Zhuravlyov is sitting in a Grozny prison, apparently getting beat up by Kadyrov's son, Adam Kadyrov, which is, again, the reason I'm bringing this up is because the Ombudsman of Human Rights in Grozny, actually, which apparently there's an office of an Ombudsman of Human Rights for the Russian Federation in Chechnya. Funny enough, I didn't know this office even existed, but the Ombudsman said, we have opened up a case investigating this young man because apparently he's been beaten up by Kadyrov's son personally in the Chechen prison. And it's like, yes, this guy's edgy. He's whatever, an SBU collaborator, but should prison abuses over these young Russian weirdos even take place? I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think that's probably a good punishment, sending these even degenerate Russians into Chechen prisons. Again, maybe it's to appease the Russian-Muslim relations and perhaps appease Turkey, but Turkey doesn't seem to bite. Erdogan doesn't care about Sweden burning Qurans. This is like Erdogan is like a wolf who has smelt blood, maybe ever since the Wagner coup attempt, and he's seeing some sort of weakness amidst Russian domestic policy and possibly even foreign policy, because again, Russia hasn't really progressed past Bakhmut recently. Yes, there are small gains up in the Kharkovskaya Oblast and Zaporozhye, and of course Russia's holding very strongly on the defensive end, but there's still that hesitation. And Niger is supported, but not openly. Of course, Russia doesn't say we're going to support Niger 100%. We're going to send Wagner, and nobody's really saying that. It's all kind of unofficial behind the scenes. And I think Erdogan is going to play off that and just win more political sovereignty points for himself and for the Turkish people, because he himself is a really conscientious actor in world politics. And we can't really downplay Erdogan and say that he's a Western puppet. That's simply disingenuous. I think he's his own type of character. He may be a bit gray. He's not really black or white, but he does do things for the Turkish people. So, and that needs to be considered.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, people are talking about Niger, the impending, possible Western-backed, war between ECOWAS and Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali. But as the Black Sea heats up between Turkey and Russia, and as the blood becomes, fully bad between Putin and Erdogan, we're going to definitely see an increase in pressure in Syria, as Russia is going to strike the Turkish proxies there a lot harder, try to drive them even further back up into the northwest of the country, up back past into the Turkish border. We may even see, again, that kind of stuff will keep Russia more in the Armenian sphere of things, in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. And while sure, France is the #1 adversary in the current, actual coup conflict in Niger between the other countries in the Sahel region, a lot of the African proxies between Russia is actually between Russia and the Turks. I mean, in Libya, those are the two biggest forces backing the two forces there. It's, the Russian-backed forces, and then there's the Turkish-backed forces there, and the West happens to align more with the Turkish-backed forces, just like they kind of do in Syria. And, Azerbaijan is the only place where kind of the West slowly kind of, leans towards Armenia, but they, generally are somewhat staying out of that conflict. The main backer of Armenia being Iran, of course, so that might keep the West hesitant to go full in on, backing a Christian country like that. But as the Black Sea just becomes this Russian lake, we've already even seen the Ukrainians request that the Romanians, near Rainy, down near the border on the Odessa region, they need to stop sharing the videos. It's showing them getting pummeled too hard. Even apparently, like some of the ship routes that can just hug the coast from Odessa, Romania, down all the way around the Black Sea, down into the Straits. I mean, that's going to be threatened by, them striking right up into the borders. So, I think the Ukrainians have a vested interest in not, they've gone full cover with the sheer amount of beatings they're taking, whether it's on the front line, whether it's the strikes in the ports, or whether it's even some of the strikes on these ammo depots, or even some of these mercenary outfits at different parts that NATO is staffing are getting totally smoked. And again, that the counteroffensive has just not been going like that. So as of now, Lukashenko, taking it all back to that, he definitely seems, frankly, in a better position to be, dictating terms and telling people whose territory goes where than someone like Erdogan, and definitely more than basically any individual collective West leader, which, that's going to be the whole thing. Like, sure, like Ukraine is taking the most losses, but the amount of diplomatic kind of civilizational losses being taken here, like the West doesn't want Lukashenko to be able to act like a powerful statesman just on the world stage. But because of his, commitment to Russia, the special military operation, and then their, of course, support for his kind of autarkic power, they have to listen to him. Everyone is listening to the latest Lukashenko interview a lot more than they're listening to the latest random NATO apparatchik, because we already know what they're going to say. They're going to say, oh, well, we're going to give them more stuff. Like, that's really all it is. That, and like very subtly perhaps looking for an off-ramp, or starting to talk about the Crimea rhetoric being ridiculous. But it does seem that, Lukashenko is more so in the driver's seat than the West would definitely want him to be. And there's been, certain maps released, and just the Ukrainians are now talking about how, we talked about this on the last episode, how there's this mobilization.
Mhm.
Lukashenko talked about the 250,000, volunteer reservists that the Russians have. There's probably even going to be a bigger calling up of troops, and even possible bigger mobilization. And then, as many are saying now, February is when there's going to be this big push. And Dimitri, I'm wondering your thoughts, if you think any of that push could come from Belarus with Wagner, or if it'll mostly just be Donetsk and Kharkov. Like, I think that'll still be where the focus is. But Lukashenko made that comment that,
Mhm.
To win the war, you need to take the capital. And he told Putin that at the beginning of the special military operation. And Putin said that he could have easily done it. He just didn't want to kill civilians.
Right, absolutely. But as we've seen in the end, civilians did die, and civilians continue to die, because that's just simply what happens in war. Unfortunately, that's why war is really, it's really an example of what happens in a sinful world. It's like one of the most exaggerated forms of, how corrupt this world is, and why, sin really much seeps into everything, and especially it's obvious in Ukraine, domestically, and especially what's happening in terms of like the war on the ground. But let's just consider the fact that Lukashenko, I think, is still in that process of preparing the Belarusian army. Only, I believe it was earlier this week, officially Wagner, or it was announced that Wagner will be training the Belarusian military. So that will take a few months. So I don't believe Lukashenko and his army will be actually ready for a full-on scale great northern invasion of the western Ukrainian lands. And we don't really envision Lukashenko riding into the Pskova-Pechersk Lavra on a white horse carrying, a flag with Christ on it, and Wagner forces with skulls like flying helicopters over the Lavra and freeing it from Ukrainian neo-Nazis. That probably won't be happening anytime soon, but perhaps in 3 to 6 months, because we recall that's exactly roughly how long the Russian mobilized troops took to train. And notice there's very interesting tidbits from the interview, because he mentioned the number 250,000, very specific number. It's less than the Russian mobilized last time. It's almost as if he has exact data and he's just leaking DMs. Like Putin told him at one point, it's like, oh, how many guys do you have in the back? And Putin's like, oh, about 250,000. And Lukashenko's like, okay, and then he just leaks it. So again, it's almost like the DM leakage is on the Putin front, where he just accidentally spills like almost top level government secret about how much money was provided to Wagner over a year and a half, is 1 billion USD. And Lukashenko is like, oh, it's exactly 250K. It's like, why 250 and not like he could have said 450 or 350 or even said 300,000 again. But nevertheless, so I'm actually thinking these numbers are real, and that's most likely what Russia has in its back reserve. These are people not yet actually on the front lines. So very sort of curious that, well, again, this is pre-second wave mobilization, which everybody, including the victimized Strilkov, who's still sitting in prison, have been talking about for a while, and it's good news, because that's what will be required. So Lukashenko mentioning the taking of Kiev as the main objective. The only reason Russians couldn't actually take Kiev last year in February and March was because there wasn't enough troops. Like there was a lot of armor, there was a lot of air support, but there was simply not enough troops to cover all of that land mass. Russia, invaded Ukraine with 50,000 maybe at most. At most, it was nearing 100,000, but it simply wasn't enough to cover all these vast territories and all these cities and keep this landmass under control. So Gostomel turned out to be this tragedy, and so here we are, of course. But we have all that footage of destroyed tank columns, and it's all very obscene, and Ukrainians use it for propaganda purposes, of course. It's quite glad seeing Lukashenko do this. And we spoke about going for Kiev for a while now, and mostly from like a religious perspective, because I spoke to a few of my friends yesterday, in fact, and Putin and the Russian Federation could be using propaganda of actually freeing, and this is not even, I'm not saying propaganda in a utilitarian, perhaps pragmatic sense, but in a literal Orthodox Christian sense. The Lavra is now being raided. The priests are being abused. Orthodoxy does need saving in a sort of physical, material sense. It does need, the icons need to be preserved. Icons are being exported out. There's a threat of like potential Orthodox relics being taken to Europe for safekeeping. And this is, Constantinople 1204 going on here. I don't know if anyone's noticing, but there are Orthodox icons from the 6th and 7th century pre-iconoclasm. So, from the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai, which were exported from the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra to the Louvre in France. And now they're on display in a museum. That's even worse than St. Basil's Cathedral being a museum, because you have these very old icons which people have been praying in front of for hundreds, more than 1,000 years at this point. And so these are treasures of the Orthodox people, which people would, Orthodox folks were venerating in Kiev, in Russia, etc. And now they're they're taken to Western degenerate museums, and they're shown alongside Picasso paintings. So it's a very bad look. It's also disrespectful, because we know the people who run these museums are complete globalists, and they're all triple vaxxed and whatnot. So it's all a matter of humiliation. It's an embarrassment ritual. It's some Illuminati type situation going on here. So that's also there to be considered. Lukashenko saying let's go for Kiev is completely supported. That's exactly what should be happening. That sort of rhetorical push, and I'm glad he's kind of displaying it in a full sense. I think it's positive.
Yeah, I think this, again, it's not that I necessarily think he calls Putin like, Putin, can I do this interview, please? But it's like he wouldn't do an interview if he thought that, Putin would, come after him. He probably wouldn't. Like you said, I'm always interested in how, the interplay between who knows what information goes. But you mentioned Mount Sinai, St. Catherine's Monastery. Be sure to check out our latest episode of Ether Hour. I just posted the link in the live chat. Be sure to check it out. We talk about Ivan Grozny, who, if you listen deep in there, we have some details about him, and he has a relationship with St. Catherine's Monastery and Sinai. So be sure to check that out. Subscribe on Substack, worldwarnow.substack.com. It really helps us out, supports us. And yeah, be sure to send in your super chats if you want us to answer any questions. We'll answer about anything, whether, recent events, broader things, broader questions, space. The one that we have a question already about Russian movies that I'm sure I'll ask. And Dimitri will have a much better answer than me. But yeah, we're having a good time here this evening. So yeah, but I mean, I was grateful for the Lukashenko comments. You know, he always says something throughout the week, and this was the best presentation of any I've seen with the map and the pointer and everything. But in the title of the stream, we say directed energy weapons, which I always make a joke that, you know, if we don't vote against the right, well, if we don't you know, kind of fix things here in America, everyone's going to end up drafted on a flotilla in the Black Sea, getting hit by a Russian directed energy weapon. But people are talking about these Maui fires. We're having all these other fires around the world. In past shows, Dimitri, you've mentioned the Russian fires. There's been Greek fires, and I'm not saying that there aren't wildfires in the summer. But I've already seen videos of leftist activists starting fires. I've seen some pretty interesting stuff about possible directed energy weapons being used. I've heard some recent whistleblowers from Antarctica talking about how there's a big earthquake machine down there. We already know that the Turkish earthquake was likely, you know, had influence of directed energy weapons, which, you know, ties into why I'm always afraid of, you know, having those used on me in the Black Sea against my will after a military draft. But I think, you know, this is on everybody's brain. Some people think, you know, this is cast unseen, polluting the discourse, schizophrenic stuff that no one should talk about. But I mean, the Maui stuff is interesting. Now Oahu is burning. We know there's all these rich people with property. You know, there's, you know, who knows how small scale or broad the conspiracy on it could be. But we do know, and I've seen Chinese military videos, United States military Navy videos of these directed energy railgun type weapons being used on the high seas. So they definitely exist. The question is, of course, do, you know, planes use them to create civilian catastrophes and false flag scenarios? That becomes a broader question. I hope I'm not destroying my YouTube channel talking about these sorts of things. But yeah, Dimitri, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on some of, I mean, there's been fires all sorts of places. I know, I mean, from Australia to Canada to, I mean, the US as
Yeah.
well. It's a sort of a thing. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on, if you think it's all, you know, it's just the fire season, or if there might be something more afoot.
Well, that's right. I think even before COVID, 2019, 2020 saw some pretty major fires, even in quiet, you know, sort of sacred and secluded places such as Siberia. So, and you know, these fires burnt up so much that they caused so much destruction over like such a large territory, which, you know, it's quite pressing, especially for those folks believing in global warming, because, you know, all that gas going up into the atmosphere, all those trees being destroyed, it's of course a tragedy, and it stresses a lot of people out. And naturally, of course, it destroys nature. It's really bad in that sense. But it should be mentioned, like this high technology weapon show that's been put on, or at least, you know, these traces we see in the media. It kind of coincides of almost in the United States these perhaps psyopy news regarding aliens. And in fact, that keeps coming up in congressional hearings, where it's like, oh, all these people are essentially speaking under oath, claiming that yes, there are, you know, the United States government has been in contact with aliens, with these extraterrestrial forces, and they are developing some sort of programs or technologies alongside the, you know, it's literally stuff out of X-Files. And I'm almost thinking like that's a distraction for the fact that technology such as these, you know, high-powered lasers, as well as geotectonic weaponry, actually exists. And in order to take some of the attention away from the governments themselves, we can of course speak about outer space, random satellites, these weird you know, weird tech which maybe doesn't even exist, or even worse, like UFOs, for example. And we're not talking about hollow earth type UFOs, so intraterrestrials, it's extraterrestrial forces, which it's somewhere out in space. It's somewhere, it's things which really aren't really palpable, but they somehow appear all the time in the United States, and simply distract people from what's happening in the world for real, which is there is very strange tech being used. And even today, like at Ukraine, we see this kind of still within human limits, within human palpability technology, such as underwater drones, like crazy tech being used. And of course, hypersonic missiles from the Russians. Technology is really pushing it on the Ukrainian side, and part of me thinks, like, is there stuff that Russia and, you know, the United States, for example, still hasn't exposed, and the war still hasn't escalated to a point where this technology will need to be used soon, you know, against one enemy against the other. So Yeah, it's really a geo religious warfare we're facing here, with a touch of this absolutely next level tech. And I think something like, we have to also consider like something like COVID-19, right? When we claim, oh, but some of these technologies, surely they can't be developed without any leakage, right? Like, I mean, surely, like, everyone's watched Oppenheimer, and when the nukes were developed, developed under like a top secret prerogative. Nobody could ever leak some of this information to either the Nazis or the Soviets or the Japanese. And in fact, no, it is actually possible to develop these programs. There are such compartmentalizations and clearances which allow for these technologies to be developed without any sort of information spill. And we see that quite clearly with something like COVID-19, which to this day nobody really got in trouble for, not Fauci, because it was so because they created this thing somewhere in a Chinese lab in Wuhan, and we're still not sure exactly, and of course it wasn't even a dangerous disease, but the fact that it spread so quickly and it caused all this economic damage, surely this was a completely artificial creation. And of course this pandemic still somewhat haunts us to this day. And that was created under complete secrecy. Nothing was leaked until it was too late. So it makes me think some of this military tech most likely is also there in existence, and of course we won't be finding out about it until it's actually put on show, similar to what's happening in Maui right now.
Well, there's been more talk about the bio labs. I can't remember who I recently saw talking about it, but there's been more and more people. I mean, of course, Robert Kennedy Jr. went on Tucker Carlson and talked about that a lot recently, which, he's been blowing the lid off. He's been bringing more and more things that, I mean, a lot of us have been known about vaccines and these other things for a while. And RFK Jr., he was, people, remember with Del Bigtree, all those other things back in, decades ago at this point, talking about not just COVID, but other vaccines. So it's, he's bringing light on some of these other topics. But I think you're right with there's no way that you can say, oh, this would have leaked. Anyone still saying that kind of stuff is definitely hasn't been paying attention for the past 3 years minimum.
Yeah.
But I think the likelihood that some of these fires, like in Maui, again, sure, maybe it's all like a coincidence, but there's no denying that there's at least people with a vested interest in seeing these things be exploited. We saw the videos of the police preventing people from showing up at that center distributing things. We've seen videos of police, stopping firefighters from entering certain areas. So there's definitely there's something strange afoot. And I do believe that even without the directed energy stuff, there's been enough videos in places like California, Italy. I've seen videos in Italy and Greece of just people being caught just lighting fires in the places where the wildfires are already raging. So, extremely illegal, extremely satanic activity, the destruction of God's creation. A lot of this, of course, ties into the climate change stuff. People are gonna, every time like the fires, the world is burning. I'm here in Texas. It's insanely hot, like it's miserably hot outside. So, I joke that I'm joining Team Bill Gates. Like I'm pro cloud seeding now. Like block out the sun, please. But like, these are the sorts of things that they burn down enough area. There's talk about Maui becoming the first smart island. Turning the whole island into one of these 15-minute cities. Which, if that happens, we can definitely say that there were WEF-esque Rockefeller, foundation forces behind all of that. Of course, there's Oprah, all these celebrities. The Obamas have a house on Oahu, which is burning now. So it's not too hard to put your red string to the next place on the cork board to really start connecting these dots. But of course, there also are people posting like clearly fake footage of like directed energy beams hitting the ground and then an explosion, clearly made in like After Effects or something. So we don't need that kind of, disinformation going around, but that doesn't discount the objective existence of directed energy weapons and why it doesn't make some sense that those easily could just look. We know chemtrails are real. Why wouldn't something like this perhaps be going on as well? But I think I want to move on a little bit. Of course, Brics is coming up. Obviously, we've talked about Turkey. We always knew before any of the Ukraine's, the Sweden, Ukraine, NATO stuff happened. We were always predicting that Turkey and Russia would be. Look, they've been exchanging blows this whole time. If you're paying attention behind the scenes, there's always tit for tat stuff going on in Syria, even in the Black Sea, in some of these diplomatic relations and other things like that. But the media doesn't cover that because, the Turkish-Russia axis isn't what the West wants to propagandize us with. They want us to think Russia is, stealing our elections and doing all these sorts of things. So it never really makes the headlines like some of the other stuff does. But it's true that Turkey is now totally kind of shifted much more than I think Erdogan would have wanted into the Western camp. Meanwhile, we're seeing, again, I think some of the BRICS stuff was a little overhyped, as we're seeing India, I think, throw some cold water on it. Of course, India and China are in this state of conflict that is always going to be exploited by the West. So with those being the two most populated nations in BRICS, there is, I think, a bit of a ceiling on exactly how, because like people are expecting that this next BRICS summit they're gonna start a BRICS military and declare a gold-backed currency and all this stuff, which, like, sure, maybe there's some dramatic things that make shifts, but like that would be insane. Like, does anyone? First off, most people didn't even know what BRICS was before the past 2 years, and those of us that did, just think of the previous conferences. Did anything even close to that dramatic ever happen? Of course not. So you got to temper your expectations there, but at the same time, the fact that Turkey is no longer, it's not really considered in that BRICS sphere as much anymore, despite it fitting all the characteristics. It's a Eurasian country, it's a Muslim country, it's an autocratic country where Erdogan, basically rules with a, somewhat iron fist. But due to the civilizational nature of history and, like, the echoes of the Ottoman Empire, the echoes of the alliances between the Anglo and Ottoman empires, the influence, of course, of Israel, and just the historic relationship between Turkey and the Third Rome and Russia, this is how it's shaping up. And I think it's one of the main vindications for bringing in all of the analysis that we do and bringing in each node and using that, whether it's the words of someone like Metropolitan Neophytos, people like Strelkov, bringing in all these disparate orthodox and realist pieces of analysis to form a broader picture, make predictions, and kind of prepare for the future. I think the Russo-Turkish kind of drift, despite their current similarities in the face of the modern world, is some of the best evidence for all of that.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting that the BRICS summit coming up in South Africa, it is such a big mixing of cultures. So it has that real multipolar feeling to it, which it's different from, say, something cosmopolitan and it's almost like a Star Wars Coruscant type feel, where it's literally people, like the representatives from different civilizations, coming together to discuss economic issues we have, and even the art and the poems, which are always published on these official BRICS websites, where they talk about it's mostly quite useless news, frankly, because it's mostly they're talking about cultural interchange, which we know is probably not possible on that level, right? There's no way India and China are going to intermix and allow for some sort of hybrid culture to emerge, or even South Africans are not going to, say, share their culture with the Brazilians. It just doesn't work like that, right? And so, of course, these grotesque art forms and poems appear on the official websites, which they look very bizarre, frankly. Some of the BRICS collaborative I mean, it's a little bit postmodern, where there's a seat and there's almost like this a Chinese man, a black man, and a white man sitting together reading the same newspaper. Like, this is all very funny and cool, but I think everyone wants to get to the crux of the issue, which is CBDCs, gold-backed currency, actually getting away from fiat, getting away from this loan-based global economic order. People don't want all this bizarre cultural stuff, which is reminiscent of the United Nations and the Black Cube. But the Black Cube, which I'm not talking about Kaaba, I'm talking about the one in the United Nations in New York. So people want to get away from that weird, like, oh, let's just end it, let's just exchange everything. It's like, no, let's keep it PG, folks, and let's just focus on the money, focus on economics, focus on trade, and maybe even focus on military exchange, training, etc. So the main leaders, of course, arriving in South Africa, and at the actually just a couple of days' time now, will be President Xi Jinping, of course, probably the leader, President Lula from Brazil, Indian Prime Minister Modi, of course, and the South African president will be there. So there's only one name missing from this list, and it's Vladimir Vladimirovich. Like, where will he be? He'll be most likely arriving via Zoom. I think Lavrov or some other representatives will be in South Africa at the time, but Putin has made it clear, and it's primarily, I think, well, for those listening to the previous episodes and actually paying attention, it's because South Africa's membership in the ICC kind of de facto prevents Putin from appearing, because South Africa will have this International Criminal Court obligation to hand over Vladimir Putin to the courts, because he will be within their jurisdiction, that sounds crazy, but and again, what does South Africa benefit from being inside the International Criminal Court? Essentially, most likely, internally, it's kind of like a fail-safe. It's saying that, well, South Africa is this long-standing ICC member. If South Africa ever experiences a coup or something, civil war takes place, they can actually prosecute and extradite whoever starts the coup or the political malfeasance and extradite him to some globalist prison in Europe. So it is a little bit scary. Being a member of the ICC is kind of like, it's not just a membership in a globalist superstructure. It's also this kind of internal safety mechanism. And South Africa isn't the most powerful or rich country, so I can kind of understand why they still remain members of the ICC. But for Putin, it's unacceptable, obviously. And I don't think he should have went to South Africa anyway. It's not really a show of weakness. It's more like just a show of mindfulness and conscientiousness. Like, frankly, at the moment, Turkey couldn't be trusted. Can South Africa be trusted more than Turkey? I'm going to say probably not, especially given the fact that they're allowed to, kill the boar and all these various chants without without any negativity coming out. And we hear about the Afrikaner genocide kind of slowly creeping over the South African end of the continent. So it's not all hunky dory, and Russia kind of responds by allowing, again, it's just we're repeating the news, but Russia is allowing white Afrikaner farmers and Boers to actually move into Russian unmanaged land and buy it, and of course buy industrial farm pieces and actually work the land, work it through the sweat of their faces and actually live a Christian lifestyle there in Russia. So Russia, that might have pissed off Ramaphosa as well, the president of South Africa. So you have to keep these things in consideration. Why Putin isn't appearing, it's not necessarily a sign of weakness.
Yeah, and it's just one of these things where I think it's the ICC thing is always so funny to me. I mean, remember the United States policy on the ICC is if anyone in the United States military is taken there a charge, that we will storm them, take them out, and take out the whole operation. So it's not like this is some institution that is vaunted in the West and just shunned by the repressive East, that just simply is incapable of embracing international human rights. That's obviously not. That's a silly narrative that I think less and less people are believing across the board, not just regarding the ICC. But yeah, I mean, with Brics, obviously Lavrov will go there. It maybe prevents some of the more personal relationships developing more strongly between some of these countries. I mean, obviously, I think it's valuable for Xi and Putin to be in the same room together, for Modi and Putin to be in the same room together. Obviously, that's something that is prevented as this war happens. Obviously, Putin's not going to be able to go to like the G20 or anything like that, where a lot of these, big photo shoots and meetings take place. But I'm sure Lavrov is we mentioned before on the show that he always proves that the Russian foreign ministry is much more, has maintained an air of respect, as a lot of the other foreign diplomats around the world have really it's just very embarrassing, this cosmopolitan class in the West that they're all friends, they're all the same people, they're all degenerates, and they all just are pushing for the most banal, silly international things, with the LGBT stuff and whatnot. But Lavrov, old school diplomat, like our good friend Jim Jatras, someone that carries respect for their nation around everywhere. So I'm looking forward to the conference. It'll be interesting. I'm hoping that maybe in the next future years I'll be able to attend some of these conferences, maybe talk to some world leaders. I've been talking with my boss, Dr. Steve. We're maybe going to make an appearance at some of these places in the near future. So looking forward to that. But you mentioned South Africa maybe being even less trustworthy than Turkey. That's probably what you could know Turkey for, though, not trustworthy. And even Rebar, Mikhail Zvinchuk, one of the most popular nationalist Russian, commentators on the war, publishes some of the best maps that anyone can find, on their massive Telegram channel. But they recently published a whole kind of analysis about Turkey and their shift against Russia, and how Turkey is fundamentally not trustworthy, and they are, very much a realpolitik state, but their interests do not align with Russia, and how they even go into some details about how their interests recently still completely align with the interests of the Anglo-American establishment, the vestiges of the British Empire around the Black and Mediterranean seas in the Middle East. So I think more and more people are starting to, again, Strelkov has been talking about this since 2014, and more people are starting to realize this, of course, for more conventional political reasons. And as I was saying on Telegram, the arc of history is starting to bend towards the saints, and it shows you, like, sure, you can, pay attention for 6 years straight to every single, little diplomatic blunder or military move between Russia and Turkey and kind of get a clear picture, or you can just read spiritual counsels of St. Paisios, listen to his spiritual children, and you'll also have a bit of an understanding of how these things are going to go down from a civilizational perspective, totally vindicating Orthodox, mystical, civilizational church epistemology.
Okay, I have to take it, since we've begun speaking about religious issues. I'm just going to have to bring up some of the coolest news I've heard recently. And for those of you who have read Dune or watched the first Dune movie, you do remember that entire film was very, very much almost, even that whole sci-fi story, almost as a copy paste of maybe even Russian history to a large extent. I think it's really worth writing about, but it is very one of the first sort of sci-fi books. So it is incredibly esoteric. From written in the 1960s. There's a lot of different imagery in that, but the reason I'm bringing this up is because we have like the Russian version of Paul Atreides arriving in St. Petersburg for a closed conference. Well, closed for us internet users, but open for the people actually attending in person, Orthodox Christians willing to join. And we see the famous historian Dmitry Matlin from Petersburg, the best Russian historian during the reign of Alexander II and Alexander III. So he's literally an expert of the late Russian Empire and unequaled historian in that regard. And he's been completely offline the entire SMO, kind of appearing in lectures and things like that. But suddenly he appears in person and he meets Gabriel Doroshin, who travels. Of course, this is the descendant of Emperor Nicholas I, the Russian Orthodox Emperor, travels from Donbass and from Donetsk, where he was stationed, to St. Petersburg to give a lecture. And Dmitry Matlin is then, it's almost like this like coalition, all these people, all these base people who we read about online and on different Telegram channels and on Kontakte channels. They're all come together in this conference, and they speak about Strelkov and the fact that he's falsely in prison. And it's like, whoa, all these based Orthodox Christian monarchists. And Sava Feodosiev sets it up. And Sava Feodosiev, if you guys aren't aware, he's a really he's an Orthodox Christian missionary, in a military sense, because he provides Orthodox Christian material to the people on the front lines as well as humanitarian aid. So he's more or less like a semi-journalistic figure. He doesn't actually fight himself, but he provides all these materials from mainland Russia, brings it to the front line of the SMO. And he made sure Gabriel Doroshin, this descendant of the Russian royal family, actually arrived in Petersburg to give his little speech. Unfortunately, it isn't published anywhere, so we don't know what Gabriel Doroshin, our sort of Paul Atreides, even spoke about. So this epic, like, heir to the empire, met with all these historians and all these base people, and then he publishes a photo of Strelkov on his Telegram page and says, "Free Strelkov" as well. It's like, I mean, it's all coming together, isn't it? And like, this is, in a way, it's this. It's good to see people who will in fact have this very palpable impact on Russian history. These big characters in this narrative who aren't, they aren't related to the Rothschilds. They're not members of these international condemned cabals. They're not members of them boys. They're not. It's good to see finally Orthodox Christian people, Russian European people participating in at least local politics to some extent, not being tainted as well. It's so the purity there is very nice, and actually seeing that happen in Russia this last week was. I mean, frankly, it should have been talked about more. But again, the stuff gets suppressed in the media because you can't have this sort of show being put on. The other, I guess, big story piece from Russia, very unfortunate news, but I think we have to speak about this first. No one has spoken about this. Happened yesterday in the city of Pskov, actually in a village on the outskirts of Pskov called Velikie Luki. Members of the Communist Russian Party, as well as certain I want to say veterans of the Second World War. I assume they're veterans of the Great Patriotic War because they have, a bunch of medals. They look like they're over 80. So actual, proper veterans. And it was probably planned by the members of the KPRF. They actually came together and they formed. They put up a statue of Stalin, a massive statue of Stalin outside of Pskov, and the justification was, well, now Russia needs Stalin more than ever. And it's just, of course, this is not something we're very happy to speak about, but we still need to mention it, don't we, Conrad? We have to be transparent. It's like, well, this is cringe. But here's the interesting part. They invited an Orthodox priest, a veteran of, I think, either the Chechen campaigns or the war in Afghanistan, literally an elderly Orthodox priest, and he blessed the statue of Stalin with holy water. So, and he, of course, blessed the people as well, and he gave a short sermon. But it gets even wilder. He gave a short sermon, and in the sermon, he gives this little disclaimer at the beginning, parental guidance recommended type disclaimer. He says, well, he's like, brothers and sisters, Stalin heavily persecuted Orthodox Christianity. and then the next half of the sermon is, well, and he also strengthened the country and he won World War II. And then it's like, and it kind of, it's funny because it's almost like a schizophrenic like vision where it's like, it's true what he's saying, even factually speaking, but it's the optics. The optics are horrible. We don't need a statue of Stalin to celebrate anything. We need maybe more churches, chapels, and places of veneration of the saints. Like we don't need, or maybe even a statue to warriors. We don't need a statue to Iosif Jugashvili, right? Necessarily. But what's even more interesting is that once this news dropped, no one was talking about it because, and even me myself, I held back because I'm like, I actually want to hear. Obviously, this is something I would have tweeted about right away, but even I wanted to hold back and see, well, who sanctioned this event? Who let this priest commit this sort of, essentially this religious form of sacrilege, blessing a statue of holy water? And no, he wasn't performing an exorcism. He wasn't exorcising the demons out of Stalin. He was blessing the statue. So it's like, okay, that's a bit bizarre. Turns out the priest was completely unsanctioned. His bishop didn't let him do that. And not just that, but Bishop Sava openly published that the Church Commission, Bishop Sava is Patriarch Kirill's right-hand man. He said the Synod Commission is investigating this priest as to who caused this provocative action, because Bishop Sava is actually very, very anti-communist and very, very anti all this degenerate Bolshevik renaissance. And so that's actually good. The Russian church has this wing of conservative, almost like White Army-esque renovationist type movement inside of it, which wants to bring back that based imperial. And Bishop Sava, he's the man who meets with Malafeyev, Dugin, Father Andrei Tkachov, and they speak about restoring Third Rome. And obviously, a big statue of Stalin doesn't, just logically speaking, doesn't really enter into that discussion. So this priest, unfortunately, is being investigated. He himself had medals. So he's a veteran. I'm not speaking negatively about him, but I'm not even going to mention his name just for the sake of not publicizing. He's probably in a lot of trouble right now. And he was probably even provoked. Like these guys might have been his veterans or his best friends. Like, oh, father, could you just come? You know how it is a priest. They're always busy, but he might have been even paid or even invited. He's like, oh, could you just bless the statue? Don't worry, we won't be filming it. And then, of course, they film it, they publish it, and the priest gets a bad rep in the news. Yep. So he kind of does it for his friends as a sort of, as a goodwill gesture. And in fact, he gets, of course, smashed for it. And now, of course, people like MAGA communists will be like, oh, hey, well, Russia still loves Stalin. It's like, no, it doesn't. In fact, the church itself is investigating this matter for it being completely out of line, because it doesn't align with the church's vision of history, with the church's vision of the saints. And again, it's if anything, these unworthy praises of Stalin only move people away from the church, because again, they begin, dissolving their vision of tradition through the lens of materialism and communist sort of Stalinism, which essentially is at the core degenerate, despite how autocratic and despite how based it may seem on the surface level. So those are the two big stories really coming out this week, and very both of them somewhat controversial. One in a positive sense, and one a bit more negative. But still, we do have to talk about it simply because if we don't give an objective account, I don't think the MAGA communists or those people on Twitter will. They'll most likely paint this through their own biased lens. They won't speak about the fact that the patriarch has not sanctioned this movement towards Stalinism, etc. They'll paint it, and they'll say the Russian Orthodox Church supports communism, which is not true.
Well, I think there's just it's really a great kind of dichotomy you're seeing here. And sure, both of these you could say are kind of patriotic groups, not 100% in line with the average, just Russian, 30 to 55-year-old necessarily. They may not be an Orthodox monarchist nationalist, and they may not also be a tanky, but just look at these two demonstrations, right? I mean, you've got these geriatric old people who I'm not disrespecting, but these people that are well past, their generation is gone, building this statue and everything, and then of course still getting condemned by the church and having it be investigated, versus, the young like Gabriel Doroshin and these others, trying to rally for Strelkov and for these other causes. Like, which of these is a more vitalist, which has more vitality behind it? Which of these is emerging into the civilization, and which is, a former civilization fading back into the distance? I think that's kind of what we're seeing now. And sure, Jackson Hinkle and Haas and these characters can talk about how communism is good. It's still a fundamentally communist state, and how, all these other things. But when it's all said and done and the chips are on the table and orthodoxy continues to reemerge, and as we say, the Tsar eventually, comes to be, that, again, in conjunction as well with the Marble King, St. John Vitatsis, who, we're going to in the future do an Ether Hour episode on.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be, they're going to be caught with their pants down with the whole communism stuff. So I think it's very interesting to see, where, how all of that is happening, because again, sure, Strelkov may be in jail. There may be some persecutions happening from, those that are patriotic from the right in Russia. But in general, I think the arc of civilizational history is bending that direction. And again, we know that, there's big things coming after this Lukashenko interview. I think we may be pleasantly surprised when September 18th rolls around. I think Strelkov may be, he may be getting out of prison sooner rather than later. I want to hear maybe your final thoughts on that, Dimitri, and then I want to make sure I get the exact words, everybody, about what is going on in Niger, because in the next few days we could be seeing a big invasion.
Yeah, I think people just need to stay positive and kind of clear-headed. The war in Ukraine is very much a black and white type situation, where Ukraine is obviously supported by the globalists, by the boys. Russia is more or less, at least the Russian people, they're fighting more or less with the people of Lugansk, Donetsk, and the free people of Crimea, as well as Kherson and Zaporozhye. That's the TLDR. But, of course, once you get into the details, it starts to become a bit more gray. But we shouldn't still forget that at the end of the day, if Ukraine does win in this conflict, there'll be not only a civil war in Russia, inevitably, there'll also be the church in Ukraine will be destroyed. And when we spoke about how the church in China was destroyed during Mao Zedong, it's possible for a local church to be completely annihilated, and that's kind of the fear. That's the risk, and God may even permit this to take place in a place like Ukraine, for the sins of the local people, as well as frankly, it just is a test of orthodoxy for those lukewarm folks who they've had orthodoxy in Ukraine for 30 years unimpinged, and they still did not attend church for all, missionary work wasn't conducted on the same level. They keep saying, we want autocephaly. And Bishop Luke of Zaporozhye says, well, why do you need autocephaly? What's stopping you from doing missionary work somewhere in Odessa, or even some of these more like Jewish cities like Uman or, Dnipropetrovsk, for example? Like, why does the Jewish community have this massive mosque in Dnipropetrovsk? Why can't we even have missionary work and like bring some of these Jews to orthodoxy? Right? There's like all these questions, and of course, Ukraine is a very big example of a failed state, and also in a way, like a big failure in terms of, well, the country hasn't developed this orthodox traditional view of itself, and in fact, the entire project may be aborted, especially if it loses this civilizational conflict. And the way Ukraine loses is if Russia loses. So Ukrainians win if Russia wins. If, of course, Ukraine wins the war, it's like technically, it's supposed to win. No, it'll be completely dismantled. Zelensky and Zelensky's parliament is talking about legalizing pornography studios, etc., legalizing pornography distribution. They're talking about legalizing cannabis, which will affect the minds of, like, most likely young people and those with mental illness. Like, there's all kinds of negative effects coming out of this. Of course, probably LGBT movement will be promoted and the church will be suppressed. So, in fact, Ukraine will lose if it wins the war on a very cultural, religious level. Civilizationally as well, it'll lose. If it's with Russia, it'll remain strong. And of course, the Ukrainian people will experience a new renaissance in terms of culture, health. Even their gene pool will be enhanced somewhat by the identical interchange between the Russian and the Ukrainian population. So that's just that's just kind of what we have at like a black and white level. And again, we go into the details, it gets a bit more murky, a bit more dirty, like, oh, there's bizarre communist stuff going on in Russia, and they're putting up Lenin statues in Kherson, and then the Ukrainians are taking him down. So, that's the small details which we speak about because, hey, we want to make the show interesting for you guys, but don't forget, don't be black-pilled by just the small things, when in fact the bigger message here is that we should be praying for Metropolitan Onufriy, for the Russian forces, for President Putin as well. We should be praying for Putin and even praying for Zelensky, praying that Zelensky, God actually enlightens him, and so Zelensky actually steps away from his evil doing, similar to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Like, this guy is headed straight for hell. Like, we're watching it live, POV, watching Zelensky straight go to hell. So if we don't pray for him, he's done. And like, of course, God has shown us through history and through the Bible, through the Old Testament, examples of people who've literally almost gone into the abyss, and of course they've been pulled out by God's grace, and that's, God does act in the world. So we should pray for Putin to make the right decisions, for Zelensky to actually change his mind, and of course revert back to the true faith, to the faith of his, who knows, his ancient Judaic ancestors, and to kind of for the Ukrainian war to actually resolve itself in the best way possible, which is Ukraine reuniting with Russia. And that's the summary, again, which we speak about all the time, but sometimes it does need to be rehashed.
Yeah, I don't think Kirill Stremusov would have tolerated, Lenin statues in Kherson, if he was around, to enforce any of that. But we covered that in the 3 hour episode. But before I talk about Niger, I wanted to talk about a second ago. I just had forgotten because there was so much good comparisons with the Strelkov, the dichotomy and everything. But You mentioned, Metropolitan Saba, disciplining this priest. I want to just briefly mention a tale of two Sabas, another great Metropolitan Saba, Metropolitan here in America, the Antiochians. Basically, almost the entire Assembly of Bishops in America has sent a letter to Elpidophoros, Archbishop Elpidophoros, everybody's favorite head of Go Arch here in the United States. He has moved forward. We've discussed this on the show before. He is moving forward with elevating Alexander Belia to the episcopacy, a defrocked Rokor priest.
That's insane.
Elpidophoros is trying to advance him to the bishop, and his claim is that Elpidophoros had withdrawn this in the past, and now he's putting it forward again, saying, "Oh, but he just won't serve on the assembly. He's just going to be, internal in our little Go Arch thing." He was unclear about the current status of the Slavic Vicariate, which he was attempting to start and have Belia be the head of. Of course, Belia led the stealing of a parish and monastery from Rokor towards Go Arch in the midst of the Ukrainian schism. So this is quite literally the fruits of the war in Ukraine coming home to roost in the United States, with the ecumenical patriarch playing the role of the globalist divider of the church. And now basically what happened was, the vice chair of the Assembly of Bishops, who is Metropolitan Saba, who's basically the highest ranking bishop on the Assembly of Bishops besides Elpidophoros himself, he says, "Your Eminence, beloved brother in Christ, greetings in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. It is with sorrow and disappointment that we received your letter on August 7th, 2023, regarding your intention to ordain Alexander Belia to the Holy Episcopacy, in spite of our concerns and objections. Our position, as expressed in letters dated June 27th, June 12th, and January 19th of the past 2 years, has not changed. Therefore, we come to you at the 11th hour, praying that, for the sake of Orthodox unity in America, you will not proceed with this ordination. Moreover, we ask that you propose to the Holy and Sacred Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarchate that it reverse the decision to elevate this individual to the episcopacy, whose conduct and canonical status have caused and will continue to cause so much division among the Orthodox Christians of the United States. Wishing you a blessed feast of the Dormition of the Most Holy Theotokos, we remain your brothers and concelebrants." Signed by Metropolitan Saba of the Antiochians, Bishop Longin of the Serbs, Metropolitan Nikolai of the Romanians in America, and Metropolitan Tikhon, head of the Orthodox Church in America. So that's very encouraging to see. It appears that it's basically become that the Assembly of Bishops will likely stop existing if Elpidophoros goes through with this, which is a tragedy. But as of now, it basically didn't exist. Rokor has been off the Assembly of Bishops ever since 2018 when the schism began. And if this goes on, I'm sure whatever body succeeds the Assembly of Bishops will include Rokor and will basically just exclude the Ecumenical Patriarchate and Go Arch, which is a tragedy because I guess in theory that would take out the Carpatho-Russians, the Ukrainians in America, and a few other groups, the Palestinian Jordanian Vicariate, and which would be a tragedy, of course, especially the Ephraimite monasteries. I wonder if they would, say or do anything. But we hope that this just doesn't happen. I hope Elpidophoros doesn't elevate this guy. If anything, best case scenario, this is just another straw breaks the camel's back, and we just get rid of Elpidophoros because he's by far the main, barrier to Orthodox unity in America right now.
Not just Orthodox unity, it's also this almost like a public embarrassment for Orthodoxy, which really needs to push through this globalist, degenerate culture in the United States in order to get through to the young people, to the millennials, even older generations who've been essentially pre-programmed to reject any sort of Orthodox Christian mindset, right, by just the seemingly capitalistic liberal culture, which is so pervasive in the Western sort of hemisphere of the world. Now, what's interesting is Elpidophoros. So Orthodoxy is always fighting uphill anyway in today's modern world because everything, the world is so anti-Orthodox to begin with. And Elpidophoros, firstly, this Belia Act, which is completely nuts. That is just it's insane. So this priest committed a canonical crime against his parish, against his church leaders, and then he was defrocked, anathematized, and he joined a different jurisdiction. And now the jurisdiction, for no reason whatsoever, this is a priest, I believe he's in Florida, right? He's being promoted to bishop for literally nothing, for no achievements. He's still quite young, he's like late 30s, early 40s. This bishop has done nothing. He hasn't shown any administrative, he hasn't done anything amazing. He hasn't built any monasteries. He hasn't. There's monks who have done more than him, and then they haven't been promoted to the rank of bishop. Meanwhile, Belia,
it's like a Viking controversy. He just pillaged and stole some property from the Russians, and they're like, "Oh, let's reward him." It's like
exactly. It's like
Viking logic.
Kind of it shows such a divided image of the Orthodox Church to all these to Western folks who are perhaps inquiring or catechisms. It's like, oh, what the heck's going on in church? All they have to do is Google who this guy is, and they'll be like, wait a minute. So we're promoting criminals to the episcopacy now? I mean, blatant. Like, why are we rewarding degeneracy? Because that's the image that's being promoted. It's just really bad. And of course, this happens alongside, what was it, a month and a half ago, when one of the archbishops during his, the laying of the hands in his enthronement, he of course says the filioque, which is completely nuts. Like, that's just wild. I'm sorry. Like, these two things happening side by side, it's almost unprecedented. It paints a really bad picture for the Greek Orthodox community in America, which is by far the richest diaspora in the United States, and so which has so much power and so much capacity to spread orthodoxy and do missionary work amongst just local Native American people. By Native American, I mean white American as well as indigenous American folks. Like, orthodoxy can be promoted by Gorach if they tried. But instead, no, we're having all these scandalous BLM support and these scandalous acts promoting Belia. Is Belia a famous missionary? Does he really need to be a bishop of the Slavic? No. Like, who is that going to benefit? Again, it's not even practical. It's just bizarre. There's bizarre, controversial, scandalous acts in order to piss off the Russians and the Russian community. And Jordanville's not going to see this favorably. This is Jordanville with the relics of St. Philaret of New York and Averky Taushev and St. Joseph, right? The one who died in Athens, who was killed by Satanists. They have all these relics, they have all these saints, all this inheritance from the Rokor tradition, this very base monastery, and they have monks there, and Metropolitan Nicholas, and they're sitting there watching this happen. They're not going to join this assembly of bishops again. They're like, Rokor is more or less independent. Then they're going to play around with these demonic acts. And so this leads to more disunity in the American Orthodox world, because, well, simply they're not going to play footsie with whatever's happening here. So it's simply, it's there's nothing good about what just took place. But I guess the positive part is that the rest of the jurisdictions kind of did unite together in condemning this act. And that public letter by the Antiochian bishop, Metropolitan, actually was a very strong statement as to what's appropriate and correct. And the letter was very polite, mind you. It wasn't like a trash-talking tweet or anything of that sort. It was a very polite letter, and it addresses Elpidophoros to his face. Your Eminence, you are making a grave mistake. And he now has to respond. If he doesn't respond and he leaves them on red, it'll be the greatest act of disrespect, I think, even possible. So even imaginable, he'll have to address this somehow. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
I agree, and it's just unfortunate. I mean, GoArch in America is just squandering some of the greatest spiritual inheritance you could get in recent times. I mean, you had a literal saint just reposed, built, over 17 monasteries in your country. I mean, look, America is not known as some bastion of Orthodox holiness or some bastion of monasticism, yet some of the, frankly, best monasteries in the Orthodox world exist in America. Like, sure, you have Mount Athos, you have, these Ukrainian monasteries, these Russian monasteries, St. Catherine's, some of these in Belarus and the Holy Land, but like St. Nectarios, St. Anthony's, Holy Archangels near me. These are very holy places. I mean, St. Panagia of Lacharon in Florida. I mean, some of these abbots are considered, saintly men to this day, true, clairvoyants, wise elders, selfless people. And this is the kind, and instead of, kind of bringing that light to the rest of the world and using that as an evangelistic tool in this land, Elpidophoros wants to play these silly games and, talk about, Greece and Hellenism and Christianity as if it's just a secular NGO. And then we get statements from, His All Holiness Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, hundreds of parishes have abandoned the ecclesiastical structure under the Patriarchate of Moscow and Ukraine and been incorporated into the OCU. Oh, you mean, stolen and, stormed and had the locks changed and, had the government come in there and arrest people and put priests and bishops in jail like that? Just the audacity. Like, it shows you that they're trying to have a historical record on the record so that when the history is all rewritten and they lie about all of this and talk about how Hitler too came in and the brave, plucky Ukrainians led by Luke Skywalker defended them, they're going to have the whole little church storyline about how, the courageous and brave OCU drove out the oppressors led by Onufri and all this other stuff. Like, they're trying to have all these statements so that when the history books get rewritten, they've got their little press. But it's not going to work. I don't see them winning the war at all. So I really don't see I think the OCU, maybe they're just going to be relegated to this little rump state when that comes to exist. But thankfully, I think a lot of these monasteries, maybe it'll be harder for Pochayev, but definitely, some of these other ones will be able to be protected. And I think that, again, we always come back to it, that's just one of the main reasons why we are very much in favor of a Russian victory in this war. But I want to talk about Niger real quick before we start to wrap this up. There's just a lot of rapid fire statements came out of ECOWAS. I'll just kind of read them right here. They say the D-Day of military intervention in Niger has been decided, but we are not disclosing when that is. The West African armies are just awaiting orders to start the military intervention. The military operation is not our preferred option, but we are being obliged to do it because of the intransigence of the Niger junta. We demand to the Niger illegal junta the immediate release of President Bazoum and his family, or they face consequences. Our main objective is for the restoration of the constitutional order in the shortest time possible. They basically say the coup in Niger is one too many. We're drawing a line in the sand, just making it clear that we're stopping Wagner right here. They had been sweeping across the region, just taking out all of our proxies and putting in their own, and we're stopping it right now. They say terrorist acts threaten the situation in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, which I wonder if that has anything to do with ISIS, that the U.S. is totally kind of coming back. I think the U.S. is bringing them back in a major way, actually. But they also say that if they go into Niger, they're not going to declare war. So a real United States type operation. Obviously the U.S. has been in, a dozen war type situations in the past few decades, yet we've never declared war officially on anybody, making, in my opinion, all of them completely illegal in the eyes of American citizens. But regardless, obviously it's heating up there. Dimitri, I want to hear your thoughts on Niger. We can jump back to what we were talking about earlier as well, because it's still important.
Yeah, I think what we might see in Niger is essentially a Wagner versus ISIS/American proxies 2.0, perhaps. Maybe even America will pull some strings and get whoever those degenerate Muslim extremist factions from Libya who were essentially enslaving people and killing people all over the place. Post Gaddafi will maybe travel down south, enter Niger, and of course start spreading chaos over there as well. And this is maybe for, the United States attempting to reach out to their NATO ally France and saying that, look, maybe we will help a little bit. We mentioned last time Victoria Nuland essentially washing her hands and saying, no, look, we're kind of done here. We can't really assist in any formal capacity, but can America use its proxies on the ground in Africa, especially North Africa? Yes, absolutely. So we might even see a Wagner. And of course, the positive part is the Wagner is incredibly trained and skilled and experienced in taking out some of these proxy forces as it's done in Syria. So it has to fought against these bizarre, very strange and horrible enemies before. And again, this is just like that Rambo Free movie where it is the Mujahideen 2.0, which the United States supported in Afghanistan against the Soviets. It is that old story of the United States supporting essentially a faction which doesn't align with it in any ideological sense. Not liberal, they're not democratic, but they are supported simply for the fact that for their mercenary, chaotic factor. And that's, of course, what we'll most likely see in Niger. And, of course, this might be even Macron crying to the U.S. saying, look, guys, we can't lose Niger. France cannot lose this uranium, the potential gas line being at risk. Europe cannot lose this right now. In the United States, you guys need to activate whatever you have on the ground, and we need to take out this new reigning coup government, which, again, yeah, it did come to power through a Maidan type of coup. Let's not keep things. But in Africa, this stuff is more or less normal. So it's not equivalent to, say, what happened in Ukraine, which was a completely CIA-backed coup. If anything, coups in Africa are somewhat part of the tradition at this point. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but after the African transition into from post-colonial sort of abstract existence to democracy hasn't been the smoothest one. And in fact, perhaps democracy isn't the pathway to Africa. Maybe African countries do need to embrace some sort of traditional, perhaps even Christian type dictatorships, maybe even monarchies. Maybe that's the way African tribes is to be led, through a more or less tribal-like based system. Maybe this whole idea of democratically voting and using some of these even newer technologies. I mean, it's almost bizarre because the newer the voting tech, the more subverted it is, as we've seen in the United States the previous election. So we can't even say that the next leader of Nigeria should be elected, because democracy has proven itself to be a completely falsifiable political construct. And we know it's controlled by money. We know it's controlled by the media. So me and Conrad, despite us not liking Maidans, not liking coups and all these bizarre events, and we wouldn't be happy if Prigozhin, say, took power and started executing random people. But there is that factor of, well, democracy doesn't work either. We know what the alternative is, of course. We Orthodox Christians, and of course Muslims also have their own version of sort of divinely ordained monarchy and caliphates and emirs, and there are these traditional systems which could be embraced on the ground, which of course could lead to more just forms of government rather than whatever postmodern forms may be taking place right now in Africa, where the Africans are somewhat trying to find themselves. They're like, wait a minute, these Western democratic models really don't work. They don't work in the US. They don't work in Europe. These elections are always falsified. All the right-wing conservative parties like Meloni's in Italy, even the most base parties, they make it into office and then their policies change. Meloni's is like, oh, we're inviting 100,000 immigrants. Like, what? Excuse me? I thought didn't we vote for you because you're a based Italian lady? Nevertheless, the Africans are viewing this not dumb. Like these African politicians they're the elites of their society. For people who always claiming that Africans are dumb people, it's like no. On average, they may be less educated, but the people in control of the African nations are as elite as they get, and they're watching. They're seeing all of this take place, and they're like, we don't actually want democracy. We don't want this liberal model. It does not work. It's controlled by the media. It's controlled by the banks, by the money system, by fiat currency. There has to be some alternative. Unfortunately, Russia cannot provide a vision of that alternative. In fact, if anything, it's like the alternative right now is just a sort of platonic type dictatorship. This which is essentially existing in a way in Belarus and Russia at the moment, and even Xi Jinping. Kind of, it's like, okay, we're going to run things top down and see how things go. Which I think that's what the Africans are trying right now, and of course the US will try to destabilize the situation heavily on the ground through terrorist acts and their neo-Mujahideen, ISIS 2.0. And, this might be the re-emergence of Islamic terrorism, Conrad. Especially notice how Trump is moving towards to winning the next election. But when Trump won the election in 2016, it's almost like ISIS somewhat disappeared off the map or off the table. So it's this coincidental, like, ISIS kind of went underground for about 8 years. Now Trump's winning. Maybe ISIS needs to come back. It's very interesting ebb and flow of exactly who appears and who disappears off the world stage. And perhaps we will see an uprising again in Islamic extremism. I'm not saying all Muslims are extremists or anything like that, but these artificial COVID-19 Wuhan lab type Islamic factions, which are made like the Chechen extremists in Chechnya and Caucasus, they didn't represent the Chechen people, but these Wahhabist factions were created essentially by almost like Saudi Arabian / CIA Mossad agents and sent in to destabilize these forces. Africa has a lot of these dark elements there in terms of like these just people worshipping essentially not Allah, not the Muslim version of God or anything like that. They're worshipping straight up Satan. Like these people are, they're beheading people, they're sacrificing people to older gods than, or the old gods you mentioned in the Old Testament, like these pagan deities. So sending these people into Niger, of course, would really challenge, I think, Wagner and the Russian position there. But nevertheless, I think Russians are capable of standing their ground, and the people of Niger as well are capable of retaining their sovereignty despite all of these challenges.
Well, one thing that comes with these African countries is with some exception, the more peaceful a transition of power and the more consistent they fall into the democracy meme is basically just, which African countries are total puppets of the Anglo-Atlanticist Zog kind of system. And you see countries like Haiti, countries like Niger, even these countries have literally never had peaceful transitions of power. The president Bazoum, who'd gotten elected in Niger 2 months prior, he was the first, peaceful transition of power in all of Niger. And of course, now he's been cooed out. This is not, look, I don't even think the system works for the white man. Why the heck would it work in Africa? A literal tribal country, literal, tribal land of tribal countries. And obviously, places like Ethiopia, they had an emperor up into the 20th century as well. I mean, this is, people thought that maybe Gaddafi was going to become some emperor of some Pan-African union with its gold-backed currency. Obviously, in general, this is like a Curtis Yarvin-like talking point. Every kind of government institution is effectively run like a monarchy. It's just what window dressing do they put on it and who's like really in charge? The saying that even though he wasn't the president, Alexander Hamilton was basically the king of America when he was the head of the treasury at the time, despite, not having been the president at the time. And look, we're seeing, all these juntas in Africa. It's just kind of, they're like, look, we're technically not in a state of, legitimacy and we're getting sanctioned, but this makes sense. This is the military leader is in power and he makes the calls and then the officers executed, right? Like that's how that goes. Just like in Russia and Belarus, sure, they're not allowed to have kings or dukes or princes or whatever Lukashenko would be called if he was, honestly labeled, but they effectively function in that as an outworking of their ethnic character and how they like and prefer to be ruled, and not this globalized system like, oh, if every country just elects the person, we'll all just be able to get along. Like, no, we're done with all that. But unless you have unless you have anything else you want to say on the future of, I mean, obviously there's been some chatter about Putin's successor recently, but we have one super chat, $10. I want to ask you, Dimitri, Marshall Forward. I don't have an answer for this question, but what are your thoughts on the Russian crime classic Brother of Brat? And also, what are some of your favorite personal Russian films you would recommend? Keep doing the Lord's work. God bless.
Well, I think Brat 1 is a very culturally, it's a very artsy movie. Brat 2 has a lot more action, but definitely should be watched because they do paint this picture of like the late 80s, early 90s criminal scene in Russia and essentially how lawless it was. In fact, before Putin came to power. So if you want to view about how late Gorbachev Russia really, or late Gorbachev, the USSR really kind of transformed and moved towards a towards the early democratic version of itself under Yeltsin, and what was happening on the Russian streets, because the perspective is from this former military. I think he's a veteran of Afghanistan, the protagonist of Brat, and he returns back to Moscow. Similar to when we speak about, well, how can a potential Russian civil war scenario occur these days? Well, if Russia loses or signs a peace agreement of some degenerate sense, the Russian forces will return home to Moscow, to Petersburg, and what will they see? They'll see gay clubs in Moscow. They'll see abortion at really high rates. They'll see like fresh and fit type, situation, like literally like bizarre stuff going on the streets, and they'll be like, "What were we fighting for?" And they're either going to join criminal gangs, or they're going to start, causing trouble in the streets. I'm not saying that the Russian troops will do these things, but there is that potential, and Brat really covers that. So Brat, he comes back from either the first Chechen campaign, or he comes back from Afghanistan, and he's a veteran, and he's like, hold on. And him essentially gets involved in the Russian crime scene, and essentially it kind of goes on from there. If anything, he tries to save his brother, because the movie is called Brother, so he tries to save his older brother from the Russian mafia. And then, of course, he does save him. So it is a really good movie about family. The first film is very slow paced, not much action, but it's worth watching. The second film, it's brought to both of them go to America, and they get involved in the American gangster LA scene, and that's just crazy. The second film has so much action. It has a lot of like interesting racism as well, against, like, from an African perspective, against they get involved with African American gangsters and stuff. It gets pretty wild. So it's a pretty fun movie, number 2. But to get to number 2, you have to first watch number 1, because you can't just skip and get to the good part. And you have to take in the philosophy as well of the early 90s period. So I think even from a Christian perspective, it's a pretty good movie to see, because it's a good historical painting of how the little guy felt in those early 90s, and how the little guy was disenfranchised, how even a veteran. And it's really sad because the protagonist in the movie, the actor who plays the protagonist, died in an avalanche accident, a freak accident. He died in I believe Bagrov died in the late 90s, I think, and simply didn't film any more movies after Brat 1 and 2. So it's kind of like this is his main memory is for these films. And I think he was an Orthodox Christian too, but really good films. Some of my favorites. I watched them as a child and rewatched them many times growing up. So definitely recommend people give it a watch, even with subtitles. It's a real cultural classic. I'd say some of the best movies coming out of post-Soviet Russia. Definitely.
Yeah, I haven't watched too many Russian movies. I like Tarkovsky, Andrei Rublev. This is a great movie. There's movies like The Island. We've talked with our friend Father Joseph Gleason, who's now on Twitter. Check him out. We're going to be perhaps talking a little bit about this documentary about the Solovetsky Monastery that should be coming to America soon, getting new English subtitles and whatnot. Very good. Some great work by a budding Orthodox documentarian who has a gift for cinematography. But Dmitry, did you tell us some of your favorite Russian movies? Did you end up watching the Cheburashka the new Russian movie?
I have. I thought it was nice watching it because it had very innocent humor. So it had something which a lot of the American and even Western Hollywood movies, European movies, they've lost over the past few decades. Well, I would say even the last decade. So there are no, unlike this, for example, compared to, say, the Barbie movie, for example, which is semi-comedic. It has these traces of feminism, LGBT, all these bizarre things. And I'm not really like pulling the cat's tail here. I'm not like speaking about something which, I'm just not, this is not cliche. It sort of is, because everybody's like, well, Western movies are degenerate, but in an actual palpable sense, you watch Cheburashka and you're like, hold on, this is so G-rated, PG-rated, and it's still funny somehow, and it's still cute, and it uplifts you. You don't have to watch, and the movie doesn't have to have some sort of sexual humor or degenerate pornographic humor or these bizarre lewd scenes, etc., or even traces of some of this like fallen Western culture, which movies didn't have in the 1970s, even like 80s and 60s. It's really almost like a new post 1990s sort of infusion. Old Hollywood was really great. There's a reason why Stalin watched old cowboy movies, right, with the Soviet stuff. In the old Hollywood was something really amazing. Some of those old movies, even about the Old Testament characters. But Chibaroshka itself, like, really good film. I think naturally some of my favorite Russian movies, most likely. I really, even not movies, but TV shows, I would say, was definitely watch the Sea Devils. It's a show about the Sea Spetsnaz in the early 2000s. Essentially, it portrays them basically scouting the Black Sea. They're stationed in Crimea. So in Crimea, in the Azov Sea, and they're essentially investigating. It's like a Russian crime show. The Russian show, it's a hit show from the late 90s, Spetsnaz, seasons 1 and 2. Really, really good. It's about the first and the second Chechen campaigns. Pretty much a must-watch. And the classic, of course, movies like Alexander Nevsky. The Soviet Russian comedies are really, really good as well. Like Operatsiya, Kavkazskaya Plenitsa, like the Prisoner of the Caucasus, like these classic, the Brilliantovaya Ruka, for example, the how do you even translate that? The Diamond Hand. Like some of these classic Soviet comedies are so clean, it's similar to something you'd watch back in America. This is pre-Simpsons comedy. So imagine comedy before Simpsons and after it. Because Simpsons wasn't even that degenerate for back in those days, and even by today's standards, it's really it's almost like a Christian show. But you look at pre-Simpsons comedy, like you watch these 1950s, 60s, 70s TV shows in America, like Gilligan's Island, McHale's Navy, Hogan's Heroes, all these, but like these shows are so innocent and almost Christian. We watched them and we're like, hold on. It's almost as if you can imagine St. John of Shanghai watching these comedies. It's like they're actually so G-rated and they're still somewhat funny. And we may think, oh, this is lame, but this is where culture needs to go back to. This almost lighthearted, innocent type, and this innocent type of cinematography. And so the Soviet comedies, all the ones I mentioned and even more, and of course Yan Vasilievich Menyad Progressiu as well, about Tsar Ivan Grozny traveling back in time to the 1970s. They're traveling forward in time for a time machine, I believe. Yes. So Soviet scientist Konrad invents a time machine, brings Ivan Grozny from the 1500s to the Soviet era, and then Ivan Grozny arrives and he's just like, what the heck is this? And he's like in an apartment building and he's looking outside and he sees the Moscow Kremlin. And that whole movie is about Ivan Grozny time traveling. It's really funny. It's actually hilarious. Yeah, some of it. And he sees cars moving and things like that. It's like these funny comedies from the Soviet times, I think, were some of the positive things that came out of like Soviet culture, but not even Soviet culture, because that would be somewhat wrong. It's just Russian creativity and Russian civilizational creativity coming out in a Soviet sort of context. That's what we have in these movies. So again, very recommended. And the classical Alexander Nevsky movie, watch it with a grain of salt in terms of it was filmed by Eisenstein, but again, it's and some of Nikita Mikhalkov's movies, let's just put it frankly, like Nikita Mikhalkov is the famous Orthodox Russian director in Russia at the moment. His films should be watched. They're probably available even on YouTube in almost like English dubbed. So Nikita Mikhalkov, his dad, actually wrote the lyrics for the Soviet national anthem. So yeah, that's that famous director who almost passed away recently, actually, from COVID complications or something like that. But frankly, he survived, and his YouTube channel now promotes anti-abortion rhetoric in the Russian political spin. So he's actually bringing up the fact that the Russian abortion stats are more or less fake news. And again, I'm getting political here, but all the these are some of the cinematography classics from Russia, which definitely be acquainted with. And I would say Spetsnaz season 1 and 2 must watch, definitely, especially if you're into the military. If you want to see really Russian, like a Russian military type show with a lot of action, with Russians versus Chechens, like literally like epic warfare, like that is a really good show. Very well filmed, and I think even though it's old, it's over 20 years old now. It's I think it stands the test of time.
Now that's some, I think that should answer the person who asked that question as a thorough answer. We're going to wrap up here. If anyone wants to send any questions in the next 2 minutes, I'll read them off. We have this last one here from Woody Woo, who makes our thumbnails. So thank you very much for all your hard work. Favorite Russian folk tale and why, or Russian folklore and why? And of course, I recommend everyone watch episode 12 of Ether Hour, where we talk about the land of Chud, some of the more interesting aspects in Russian folklore. If you have any other Russian folk tales you want to talk about, Dmitry, I've always been interested in the idea of the Karzhalek or the Jezedka, which I believe is technically a Belarusian folk idea of a sort of an old man who's sort of long red beard and red eyes, who's sort of this helpful figure. He kind of relates to the Karzhalek idea in Russian folklore, which I guess are these little guys that lead miners out of mines and whatnot, which, it kind of ties into the idea of gnomes, which, we're gnome enjoyers here on World War Now, and we talk a lot about those guys on in episode 12 of Ether Hour. But you have any favorite folk tales, Dimitri?
I would only say just some of the classics that people like poet Alexander Pushkin kind of portrayed in a poetic sense. Some of these old folk stories, which in many cases they're almost short stories, but they're combined together to form this like epic ancient Greek type of poem about these heroes. For example, Ilya Muromets and Alyosha Popovich, and these sort of stories, of course, are in many ways it's almost like an Orthodox Russian recreation of ancient Greek myths. So Ilya Muromets, he's a saint in the Orthodox Church, but what's interesting about him is the fairy tales, essentially fairy tales and these folk stories, which aren't included in the lives of saints. Essentially, imagine if there was a story about like Saint George who slew the dragon, but there was extra lore to it. It's just like extended cut, and there's like extra stories about him going around and doing things. It's like that's what the folklore is about somebody like Ilya Muromets and Alyosha Popovich and the Berny Nikitich, all of these characters, and it's almost like a Russian Orthodox Hercules and a Russian Orthodox Jason and the Argonauts. It's like these epic, this Odysseus type story where he's going around slaying dragons and Kashe Besmertny and Ivan Tsarevich. And, Ivan Tsarevich literally translates to Ivan the, I guess Tsarevich is like Prince Ivan and the Grey Wolf. Like that sounds kind of base, right? And like he meets this giant wolf. It's almost like Game of Thronesian in a way. And the wolf can speak. And then him and the wolf go on an adventure to save a princess. And, they complete all these challenges and they see a phoenix and then they take out Kashe Besmertny, the dark warlock who lives up in the northern lands. It's just really epic type stories, which, I mean, it sounds kind of weird, but imagine this: these stories are all told not in a pagan context. None of these stories are a pagan. They're all brought up in an Orthodox civilizational sense. It's very interesting. And the Byzantium, by the way, the second Rome, the late Roman Empire, also had its own fairy tales. Interestingly enough, we have a few that actually come up like that have came through time, and there are still records of them. But they also had their own little, I guess, fictional stories, you can say, or legendary accounts about warriors who lived in Anatolia who fought against the Muslims, and all these their own little stories which didn't really make it through, unfortunately, because so much was lost from that particular civilization. But it's almost like, in an Orthodox context, fiction is still somewhat existent, especially for younger children, for people growing up, to teach people lessons alongside the lives of saints and reading the Bible and all of these things. But very sort of innocent stories, nothing like we see today, of course, but I would say Ivan Tsarevich and Sergei Volk. I just like the fact that there's almost it's really the amount of characters in that particular story about the Prince Ivan and the Grey Wolf. That's probably my favorite growing up. And I also like the painting of there's a painting in the Tretyakovskaya Gallery in Moscow where Ivan's sitting, he's holding the princess and they're riding through the forest on the Grey Wolf together, like a huge Grey Wolf. It's like a pretty epic painting. I was like, and they dressed in like this gorgeous 15th century Russian outfits, like again the Russian traditional outfits pre-Peter the Great. We spoke about on the Aether Hour the Ivan the Terrible outfits from those days. They looked really amazing, like very, very modest, and at the same time very colorful, very powerful. A lot better than the black power suits we see Russian elites wear today. So back in the day, were very these state of the art type costumes, and that's what we see in the painting. So that's kind of my favorite fairy tale.
There's some great photos of, I think, of like Tsar Nicholas and the Tsarina and everyone in the like Rurikid vestments. They put those on for some photos before, which are, those are great. I thought you had one more thing to say about the movies.
Oh no, yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's funny because that ball from 1903 in Moscow, where they took out those old costumes from museums, it shows the continuity. Can you imagine? In the Russian Empire, they didn't need to go search for these costumes or recreate them. They had them in storage because the country never had a history break from the 1500s. Even the time of troubles, like nobody burnt these costumes. Today, it's like, well, good luck actually retrieving some of these garments from the even early 1900s, even World War I uniforms. Like you have to go to like Stilkov is a recreationist, right? Or like a World War I Civil War recreationist. He had to like almost sew his own World War One costume in order to LARP essentially. Well, that's this kind of hobby, but Stilgov had to, like, in order to obtain some of this material today because of that communist break, which is why we speak out against things like the Bolshevik Revolution, is it caused the psychological and cultural break in Russian culture, destroying that sort of continuity, which causes all this mental damage to this day amongst the people, not just Russian but Western too. And yeah, just that it's cool. 1903, they get all these costumes out. It's like, oh, my great grandfather used to wear this, and they would all get dressed up and go to a ball. And again, the balls are non-degenerate. It's not like Eyes Wide Shut type ball. Which is interesting. You have that right comparison of like the Rothschilds ball. You have the Eyes Wide Shut type balls, which occur in Europe in the 1960s, and just 50 years before that, we see the type of balls and events that took place in the Russian Empire, where they're dressing up in costumes from the time of Saint Macarius and Saint Philip and Saint Job, like wholesome. The women are well dressed, the men are well dressed. It's very Orthodox. Some of the decoration has crosses on it because, again, it's all very infused in Christian culture. It's gorgeous. Just have a look at the 1903 Russian imperial ball photographs. It's beautiful, and that's kind of like if you want to think about where Eastern European dress should move from the power suits and the ties and tuxedos. Maybe it should move back towards a more traditional, to more traditional garments, simply for, I guess, for some uniqueness, for some cultural inspiration.
No, I really love those photographs. Maybe I'll share them on the World War Now Twitter. And this is probably our last question from GSP, good friend of the show, has co-hosted the show in Dimitri's absence before. He asks, what did you guys think of the film Russian Ark? And I want to say I have regrettably still not seen it. It's one of those movies that's been on my watch list since before I was Orthodox, before I was even interested in becoming Orthodox. I used to be really into film and movies. I wanted to go to film school and stuff back in the day. And I know it's shot in one actual take, like not just, hidden cuts, like it's an actual continuous one take of a movie. I know it takes place in the, in the Winter Palace and is kind of filmed throughout. It kind of takes you through like 200 years of Russian history. I've really been meaning to watch it. Dimitri, have you seen that one?
Yeah, I have seen it, and it's a painful watch, frankly. Like for someone of like direct Russian heritage, and my family comes from different sort of. Essentially, I'm the biggest Russian mix. You can find like 1/4 nobleman, 1/4 Cossack, 1/4 peasant farmer, and 1/4 essentially merchant and bourgeoisie class. So I'm essentially it's almost like every one of my grandparents came from different backgrounds of Russia. So. But it definitely does. It's a very painful movie in terms of the nostalgia and actually ascertaining what the Russian Empire, what was lost then. It's almost, imagine if the Russian Ark was filmed in the about the Byzantine Empire, going through Constantinople's Great Palace and showing the Hagia Sophia. The Greeks would be crying, like it would be painful. So maybe it's different for you guys when you watch it. But for someone of a Russian background, it's painful because it's like it actually hurts. My great grandparents were negatively affected by these events. These things were taken away from us in the country. It's beautiful. Granted, it's gorgeous, but there is that sort of like, this is what we've lost. And I think Greeks would feel the same way if you showed them a gorgeous take of like Constantinople back in the day. It probably would be awesome to view, and maybe it would instill some patriotic sense, but at the same time, it would have this sort of I wouldn't say depressive, but it would have this nostalgic feeling to it, which, mind you, I think that's, for me, somebody who's been reading and consuming more or less traditional Russian literature and culture and history for a very, very long time, and who's never really fallen away from that mindset. But for somebody who isn't aware, like GSP mentioned, like I think someone who isn't aware about what was the Winter Palace, how did it actually look like? I think it's a great watch. It kind of brings that into perspective, like the tall ceilings, the art, the uniforms, the dresses, as well as the high cultural sense, which the only place where, and I know I go down tangents, but the only place where that is preserved to this day in some capacity is in the Orthodox Church. If you ever visit, say, Christ the Savior Cathedral, the Remission Cathedral during the service, they keep a very high. You'll notice in that film they have a very. You'll see there's essentially butlers standing there and guards, and it's a very ceremonial. So the way you enter every room in the palace itself has to be done in a certain way. You bow or you walk in. There's a ceremony aspect to everything that still remains in the church. So in the church, you can't simply walk into the altar. You need to be an altar boy of a certain rank. You need to have a blessing from a certain priest. You can't simply do things willy-nilly. And what I've noticed from being in different jurisdictions around the world is the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow being the richest and the biggest jurisdiction. It has the ceremony factor is so big. It's not like the churches, some of the churches in America, Canada, and Australia that we visited in the past. This is like very strict. Like you cannot simply walk into the church and do as you please. It's like women must wear veils. If you're inside the altar, there's almost like a military type sense to it. Anyways, it's a bit convoluted, but that sense of formality is the point I'm trying to make. Is that sense of formality has been kept in the church. Meanwhile, it has almost disappeared completely in other facets of Russian culture, including politics to a great extent, unless you're literally in the presence of Vladimir Putin himself. So even the Russian Duma and the Russian parliament is very much relaxed. Like you just wear a tie and you kind of walk in. It's not a big deal. Meanwhile, the Winter Palace, it's this sort of like a sacred place, this like heart of the Russian monarchy. And yeah, I recommend people watch the Ark, but if you have a Russian background, just be wary. Like if you feel very deeply about this subject, you might feel quite sad. It might be a bit of a depressing watch. So just watch it for the historical richness.
No, I've been really meaning to watch it. But I should have watched it in my film snob days, and now I'll watch it in my Orthodox nationalist days. But Dimitri, we're going to wrap it up here. Give anyone some last chance to send in any questions or super chats. But you have any last thoughts on everything we've talked about today before I do the plugs?
No, essentially, I think just a bunch of news. Of course, stay posted. Keep following the Telegram for more or less uncensored news. We have a lot more articles coming out on the Substack. Definitely, Aether Hours are dropping hot. We have the craziest lineup of special, unique episodes for the subscribers. So definitely, if you guys want to get involved, you want to support at the same time, you want to receive more or less uncensored, unique content, which again in the English language you simply probably won't find online, simply because there's no one really to produce it. Unfortunately, if me and Conrad don't do this, nobody else will. So if you guys want to support us, definitely subscribe on Substack. It's highly recommended. You get basically the archive of all of our previous works. And just enjoy it. Give us feedback because we do take it on board, and we appreciate the commentary and as well as some of the positive as well as negative feedback that you guys give us. Definitely, stay tuned. Next week we'll most likely have a regular episode, but we'll see, maybe a live stream as well. We'll see how we plan it with the big man. So all good.
Yeah, we'll have it a little better on time next time. Maybe I think next time we do a live stream, we'll do a Twitter space as well. Make sure it's announced well in advance. Thank you so much to the super chatters. Really appreciate it. Hopefully we can talk to some more people next time. Be sure to share the streams whenever we go live. We appreciate this so much. This was a great show. Or like Dimitri said, worldwarnow.substack.com. Catch every episode of Aether Hour. We've got some very good feedback on honestly the last 3 episodes. Obviously episode 12 got some crazy good feedback. People really loved that one, but our episode about the Union of Brest and now about Ivan the Terrible have both received some pretty high praise. So be sure to check all those out. It doesn't just help on those episodes. The $7 a month you give us on that subscription helps us with the free World War Now stuff as well. So we really appreciate it. Like I said, worldwarnow.substack.com. Then also follow us on Twitter or at worldwarnow_. Follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri on Twitter at OCanonist. Follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. All these links are in the YouTube description below, so be sure to check all of those out. We're on Rumble now as well. If you want to subscribe to us on Rumble, just search World War Now. The videos are slowly but surely getting synced up from the YouTube channel. So yeah, leave comments, subscribe, worldwarnow.substack.com, and we'll see you next time.